I think it's such a powerful way to improve inclusion in the church and to show others what autism looks like in a church context and also in a
Hmm.
church leadership context. And
Hmm.
as you have developed a community and as people have reached out to you from the autism community, I'm curious about concerns or things you're noticing about the church and the church's lack of um, understanding at times, or churches that have built barriers to those with autism.
Yeah, I should say that most of what I see, and this is not always the case, most of what I see is unintentional barriers that sort of are rooted in just ignorance. And I don't use ignorance in a negative way. I use it in a way of just not knowing. So most of what I've encountered is churches not understanding some of the unintentional barriers that they put up. A large part of that is, and you talked about leadership, a large part of that is I think that a lot of churches, particularly in the West, because that's what I've studied, um, a large section of churches in the West have followed the patterns of what it means to do church, but that sort of standard was set by a group of people who all shared the same neurology. And so when you look at the standard practices in most churches in the West, you'll find that there were probably no persons like myself who sat at the table and helped to decide how we shape our worship services, our small groups, Sunday school, if that's what your church does, our mission, vision, and values. There were not a lot of autistic people who were at the table who were saying, that's good, but for someone like myself, that could be a challenge. So whenever you have the same group, same types of minds creating anything, it's always going to include some unintentional barriers that are just due to ignorance, just not knowing. So a lot of what I've seen is just simply the way that we do church has never really included not just people with autism, but the voices of disabled people at the table to help shape what the church should look like. So naturally, you're going to have these obstacles and barriers, which is why you don't see a lot of people with autism or other disabilities in the church because these barriers have been put up. So, just a great practical example of that. One of the things that I got rid of in my last church and even in my current church is most churches will have a section during the service where they encourage guests to greet one another and to, find someone new and shake their hands and hug, which is a very typical part of the Western church. And it's a very needed part for those who you want to create a high touch environment. Well, for persons like myself who have severe social anxiety, or even other persons who have anxiety disorders or OCD, people have sensory processing issues like myself who don't necessarily like to be touched unless they initiate it. Those are unintentional barriers. So I kind of did a straw poll, not a scientific poll, in both of the churches that I've pastored over the last 11, 12 years. And a large percentage of the people who were coming late to church, missing the worship experience, were coming late to miss that part. They weren't coming late because they didn't like the music. They weren't coming late because they were just late people. They were coming late because somewhere in between the second and third song, there's this time where you are forcing people to interact. And for people with, again, OCD, social anxiety, sensory processing issues, even just extreme introverts, there was extremely uncomfortable time of the service and they'd rather miss that. So they get there, they time it to get there at the time of the sermon. Now, these are the people that we complain about every week. Why is everybody coming late? We tried all these different tricks to get people to come early, give away prizes at the beginning, all kinds of things that churches do, not realizing that we put up an unintentional barrier for persons like myself. And it actually increased the number of people who were actually showing up on time because they didn't have to fear participating in a part of the service that exacerbated their invisible disability. So that's just one example. But when you create churches again, and we include different parts of the service, and the worship service is just a small part of it. But when we create services and craft services, and we don't have persons at the table who can represent various disabilities, we always end up with those types of things happening. And then we wonder why there's a large segment of people who don't participate in those types of things that our church is offering. So that's just one example of how a lot of times churches put up barriers that are unintentional. It's just they don't know. They don't know that that's a problem for a lot of people.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.